Hello, everyone. This is Rob York. I am an extension specialist with UC Berkeley. And I am going to talk to you for what I hope will be about 20 to 30 minutes about this idea of winter burning opportunities. And so the kind of backstory that I have for winter burning and my own kind of personal experience with it is that I'll be honest, I have this love-hate relationship with the idea of winter burning and also with the actual application of it. So the reason I'm hesitant and the reason I kind of dislike winter burning is that it is out of line with the natural fire regime. When we think of the natural fire regime and the seasonality of it, it's as if we're kind of forcing the fire onto the forest when it shouldn't be there. And then also there is this issue of effectiveness that it has. Of course, we know that winter tends to be a wet time of year, and so the effectiveness issue in terms of like the actual consumption that you get is something that can be seen as a downside, and I'll talk to a little bit more about that. But really, what I've come to appreciate on the positive side of winter burning is that our current kind of state that we're at in California is that it does seem to be this really good opportunity for burning, and it's more of a practical side of things, given the regulatory environment and the permitting environment, which I'll talk quite a bit about. It seems to be really, the most kind of abundant opportunity that we have. So foresters and landowners working on private land, if we're talking about burning, I think there is a really good opportunity for us to do winter burning, and I think if more of us thought about it, more of us did it, and I think cumulatively, across the whole state, then we could do good things for our land that we're managing, and also cumulatively across the whole state if more people are doing it. Because I think there are opportunities to get effective burning done in the wintertime. So that's my introduction here for kind of my, why I like actually these days I do like to talk about winter burning. Okay, so the outline of this talk, I'm going to go over these items here. First of all, what is winter burning, like what I actually mean by it. I'm going to talk really briefly about this idea of ecosystem versus permit burning windows, because as you'll see, my opinion is that permitting is really the dominant factor when it comes to when we burn. I'll talk about the pros and cons when it comes to winter burning, of course, and then where and when it may be possible for those of you considering, doing some winter burning. I'll give you some examples of where I know it's worked, and then also looking ahead in terms of new research and extension that I'm looking forward to doing over the next few years. I'm going to really briefly get into that towards the end of this talk. Okay, so first I'm going to say, and this is a joke here, and when I give this talk in person, this joke it goes over really well. I imagine it's not going over super well in the webinar format, but I like to think of it as. So when I say winter burning, I'm not talking about this. Some of you might be imagining a White Walker from Game of Thrones holding a drip torch, and that's maybe your idea of winter burning. I'm not talking about that, obviously. We are in a warm state. California is not the frozen tundra I'm forgetting the name place in Game of Thrones, but it's not that type of context, right? So we're not in a Game of Thrones novel. Really, we're out there during conditions. It's the winter time, don't get me wrong, but it's during conditions when we can actually get a burn done. Okay, so what is winter burning? I tend to think of it in these two basic categories, or these two definitions. The first being more of an ecological definition. And me as an ecologist and a silviculturalist, I want to use this. I want to use physical factors of the environment to define winter burning. So when I say that physical factors, I'm talking about how long the sun is up in the atmosphere, the seasonality of weather that we have, the seasonality of fuel conditions. We certainly know about from fire reconstruction studies how common fire was during the winter season versus the other seasons. So that's kind of that ecological definition of winter burning. And again, me as a kind of ecologist and silviculturalist, I want to use that definition, but what I really have to use these days in terms of thinking about fire is more on the regulatory side of things and the kind of policy and social context when it comes to burning. And so even though we don't necessarily, us as I think many foresters, we don't, we want to rely on physical factors to make our decisions. In the end, we have to rely on these other more social political factors. And so really for the majority of this talk, I'm going to be using this definition, more the regulatory definition of winter burning. Okay, so I think that I need to review, and some of you may already be familiar with the way that burn permits work. If you've done pile burning, you might already be pretty familiar with this. But I find that when I talk to people, that it is good to review how permits work, especially the seasonality of permitting of burn permits in California. So, and there are really 3 permit seasons that occur in California. The context here with permits that I want to start with first, though, is this idea of Zone A versus Zone B. And for you foresters out there who are familiar with the forest practice regulations, you may have already kind of have some understanding of how California is broken up into Zone A versus Zone B. And Zone B is really Northern California, so I think of it, and Zone A is Southern California. And this is an important distinction when it comes to permits. It's really important because when you look at you sometimes hear from people that permits are always required in California. And I think what happens is that people, they take Zone A, Southern California, where permits are required year-round, and they expand that and apply it to all of California. But that's just not the case. It's not true. In Zone B, it's not the case that permits are always required. And that's a really important distinction when it comes to winter burning opportunities. Okay, so back to the 3 permit seasons for private landowners. So the first season I refer to as fire season, right? So this is just the middle of summer. It's when it's really hot, when it's really dry. Wildfires are occurring. Fire hazards obviously super high. In the fire world, if you were to do a prescribed burn during this time of year, they'd call it an in-season burn. Okay, so at this time of year, like if you have a permit, if you are able to get a permit that lasts for several months, that permit can be suspended, and this is usually the case. We go into a suspension period, and if you do try to get a permit during this time of year, you won't get one, right? Because permits are suspended. There's a ban. They also call it a burn ban on private land. So in theory, you can still get a permit, and this. What I have here in the lower right-hand corner is an LE8 permit. That's really an application to get a burn permit, and this is something you would have to go through during this time of year. So in theory, you can get a permit to do an in-season burn. It has occurred. I've been on a couple of burns that are in-season burns, but in reality, it's tough. You have a snowball chance in an in-season prescribed fire of getting one of these, especially if you're a forester or a landowner who doesn't have a whole lot of technical capacity, right? So lots of wildfire, kind of suppression capacity behind you. And so it's really, I would argue that's really not realistic right now for private landowners and managers to think about getting a permit during this time of year. So the second season for the second permit season for private landowners, I call it permit season. So this is still during fire season, but it's when suspensions have been lifted, right? So this occurs during the spring and during the fall at widely variable durations. Sometimes 0 days, as I'll show you, but sometimes multiple days or weeks where the idea is it's kind of the shoulder season, still in fire season, but the idea is that conditions are not so sketchy, and therefore you can get a permit. People who live in the woods and have houses, this is, they refer to this as dooryard burning. It's the time of year when you can get a residential burn permit. That's super easy to get. Like you can get one online in many areas right now. But for doing a broadcast burn, it's beyond that residential dooryard permit that you need. It's something called an LE7. So this is a burn permit to do a broadcast burn. And it's actually pretty hard. I think if you're into prescribed burning and you've done it for a while, this is kind of what you look for. You look for this opportunity to get a burn permit, an LE7 permit. But if you haven't done it before, if you're not into prescribed burning, it could be pretty hard to get a permit during this time of year. And and it's kind of context here is that even with an LE7 permit right now, you have to have some technical expertise or some resources behind you, and really kind of the context that I'm getting at here is for people who don't have a big program, a prescribed fire program developed. It can be pretty hard to expect to get lots of burning done during these shoulder seasons. Although I will say that foresters have a high opportunity ceiling for this. And so what I mean by that is that if you can get permits to burn during this spring and fall, and you have a prescribed burn program that you build up, there is a very high opportunity ceiling where you can do effective burning, especially for foresters who know they know the context of burning and they know natural resource, objective-based management. And so to me, it's like a forester who can get an LE7 permit. That's a perfect combination because they can meet objectives and they have that capacity and skill level to actually, to do a prescribed burn. Okay, so, but really I want to talk about winter burning, which it has to do with this third permit season. And it's what, for lack of a better term, I call open burning. And so this is after fire season has ended. It's after the weather has gotten wet, and therefore it's the end of fire season. And in many parts of the state, in that Zone B, permits are no longer required. Some people still get them. I've talked to people who burn in areas that where you don't need a permit, but they still like to get them, and I can understand that. Like they like to get them. I guess they think of it as if there's an escape or something, then they have that permit in their back pocket to say, look, I got a permit, and maybe they can think about lowering the potential for liability. But it really, the idea with not needing a permit is that it's implicit in the fact that you don't need a permit is that conditions are less hazardous, right? And so I think that's really the logical reason why you don't need a permit in the first place. So it's tricky to know. To be honest, it's really tricky to know if you are until you understand like how your area operates. It's hard to know if you are in an area where you don't need a burn permit. I'm in El Dorado County where I know consistently I do get this winter period where I don't need a burn permit. The best way to figure it out is to go to to talk to local CAL FIRE agencies. Although they might not know, to be honest. So, but that's a good way to at least start a conversation. The other way is to go to this website here, and I'm going to see if I can link to it right now. My computer's not super fast. Let's see if it brings up. So while it's working on bringing this website, oh, there it goes. Stand by here. So if you go to this website, and I have this linked as a bookmark on my browser. So this website has all of the units across California. This is a CAL FIRE website, obviously. And so, and this is right now. This is today, and I'm speaking to you on April 16th, 2020. So I'm in El Dorado County, and under the status column, it says burning allowed. So what that means is it's open burning and no permits are required. Unfortunately, they don't make it very clear that permits are not required, but this is kind of the interpretation that you have to do. Burning allowed, that's what it means, is that it's open burning and you don't need a permit. So if we go down to Fresno Kings, the Fresno Kings unit, it says that permits are required, okay? So this, even though we're in the winter season and there's tons of snow above 4,000 feet in Fresno and Kings County right now, there's still a permit required according to this webpage. Now, what I would recommend is not necessarily assuming that this webpage is up to date. I've noticed many times that it's often not up to date, and they won't, especially when we enter the burning allowed season. They don't always update this webpage. But this is a good starting point to know if you can burn without a permit in your area. Okay, so just some other points here to remember. Being still limited by smoke emissions. I think most foresters understand this because they're familiar with doing smoke management plans for burn piles and stuff. The same process whether you're doing a burn pile, or a prescribed burn, in terms of smoke emissions and getting a permit through the Air Pollution Control District, it's still the same process there. And that's a very transparent process that I really like. And I'm sure many of you out there who do smoke management plans appreciate the transparency and clarity that that most air pollution control districts actually have when it comes to getting permission to burn in terms of air quality. Okay, so this open burning season, the beginning is variable because it depends on the weather. In my area this past year, it started in mid-December, and then it usually ends at May 1st. May 1st is often when the fire season begins. So we usually have a good understanding of when this open burning season is going to end, but the beginning is variable. All right, and that's just a picture there on the bottom. Let's see, that was in spring of 2016. I've shown several pictures here. All of the pictures I've shown so far and will show are from winter burns that I've been involved with. Okay, so those are the three permit seasons. Again, what I'm really talking about is this season right here when it comes to winter burning opportunities, really defined by the fact that permits are not required. Okay, so I want to talk really briefly about this idea of ecosystem versus permit windows in California. So oftentimes in the fire world, when you talk about a window, a burning window, they're typically, in general, talking about a weather window or a prescription window where the fuel conditions have come into prescription, or the weather has, the humidities have gotten down low enough to open up a window. And that's what I would call an ecosystem window. And what I want to point out here is the degree of overlap that we have between the ecosystem window for burning in California and the permit window that we have in California. That overlap is very small, to the point where in some areas there is no overlap at all. And my example here is that in 2018 in El Dorado County, and this is from burning at about 4,000 feet elevation, 2018, on a year where I tried to burn, I had a lot riding on fall burns in terms of research that year, so I tried to burn every day that I could during what I would call the ecosystem window in the fall. So during good fuel conditions in the fall, where I could get a good hot but not risky burn done. And there were only 3 days where I could get a permit to burn during that window, during that broad weather and ecosystem window that I had. In 2019, more recently, it was 0 days. There was not a single day. Despite a really good ecosystem window, we got 2 inches of rain in September, and then mostly stable weather after that. A couple wind events here and there, but mostly stable weather. But my permit window was 0 days. I had 0 days in which I can get an LE7 permit to burn during that window. And so my point here is that we have these several, when we want to do ecosystem burning, we want to burn in the fall. Those of us, who are into kind of, at least mimicking the natural fire regime, but it's difficult because of all these constraints. So these constraints here on the bottom, air quality, fuel conditions, weather forecast, those are always going to be constraints no matter what time of year. But in the fall and in the springtime also, during this permit season, we have these other 2 really big constraints: just getting a permit at all, and then the politics and resources around burning at that time of year are tough. You hear this term called bad optics. I mean, that's not just in the fire world, but you hear in the fire world these days, that it's bad optics to burn when there's another a large wildfire occurring in the state, or there's a red flag warning occurring somewhere in the state. So that is a legitimate kind of social constraint that we have. So when it comes to winter burning, really, the beauty of it is that we don't have those 2 constraints, not nearly as much as we do in the fall and the springtime. The downside is that we don't have windows. We don't have windows of long periods where the weather is good, but we do have winks, right? So a wink, what I mean here is that a wink is a small period of time where you come into prescription from a fuels perspective and from a weather's perspective. It might be a few days, it might even be a few hours within a certain day in that winter time period. But when you do come into prescription, you get down, you narrow the field of constraints down, where it's just air quality, it's just fuel conditions, and it's weather forecast. It's really all you have to worry about, and that's really, a beautiful thing when it comes to prescribed burns. Okay, I'm going to check my time here to see how I am doing. Okay, I'm going to need to pick up the pace a little bit. So winter burning pros. So like I said, no permit is required in many locations. The low risk aspect of it, I think, is really appealing to a lot of people. It can be, I know that it is very effective from measurements I've taken. It's effective at inhibiting the ladder fuel development. So it's the idea of killing the thousands of seedlings that are out there before they become ladder fuel, which is relevant for a shaded fuel break maintenance type of context. Definitely effective at reducing the fuel size that has the biggest impact on fire behavior. So I'm talking about small diameter fuel, litter, 1 hour, 10-hour fuel. It's effective at reducing that category of fuel. And then also, like practically, it's a gateway burning, right? So it's a gateway into getting more experience for permit burning that's a little more technical in nature. So some cons, high density forests need prep work potentially, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in another slide. In general, there's less consumption. That's just a reality of winter consumption, or sorry, winter burning. We have trouble consuming those larger fuel size classes, and therefore it could take multiple burns or multiple years to accomplish objectives. This is a big one here. Local fire suppression personnel may not understand it. This is getting better. I like to think that it's getting better, and there is more of an agency-wide, within CAL FIRE, there's an agency-wide effort that I see going on that is supposed to provide consistency across units. But the reality is, and I have my own experience and other people's experience with this, is that your local fire personnel might not know that you can burn during the winter without a permit. And it takes this kind of conversation and education to occur before they can understand it. And then lastly, I've mentioned this before, but it's not aligned with the natural disturbance regime seasonality, because we know that most fires in the natural regime tended to occur in the summer and in the fall. Okay, some factors of where it can work and when it might work, kind of, broad regional kind of ecological factors, and then also some stand level structural factors. So as you can imagine, it works better in lower elevations, right? So the kind of main thing is that if we're below that snow to rain transition line, so basically where there's not a persistent snowpack, obviously we're not winter white walkers that can burn in snow, and so there of course has to be no snow for us to burn, and so it's beneath that transition line where we can pull it off. Of course, south versus north-facing slopes, for basic reasons that we all know about, the south-facing slopes give us much greater opportunities because of the fuel drying out. We have much more frequent opportunities to burn on south-facing slopes and west-facing slopes as well. In terms of at the stand level, it tends to be much better, of course, where the canopy cover is lower. A good rule of thumb that we've discovered over the years is that if you have less than 50% canopy cover, you will consistently get good winter burn opportunities if you're below that rain to snow transition line. It doesn't mean that you have to have less than 50%, but the point here is that consistently you get periods during the winter where you can burn. This past winter, I was able to burn where, in this picture, this photo is from a winter burn done in February on the left in a really open stand where the canopy cover is about 60%. It was so good, the winter burning weather was so good that I was able to burn actually in that forest that's to the right, that stand to the right in this picture, where canopy cover was much denser. It was more like 80%, and I was still able to burn there. But consistently, if we can manage that canopy level to be 50%, then we have pretty good opportunities consistently to burn every winter. Okay, overstory species composition. This is huge. This is so important. So when we have a pine litter, a ponderosa pine needle litter layer, our opportunities for burning are much greater. This is well known by people who've done a lot of burning, and this is in the literature as well. So ponderosa pine especially, the crown density is lower, right? So therefore you have a lower canopy density. The litter that it creates has a lower bulk density and high resin content, and so it's more flammable. And you can also do the snap needle test. For those of you who don't know about this, this is a wonderful and elegant and beautiful way to figure out if you can pull off a burn. You simply take a pine needle and you bend it, like in this picture. You bend that pine needle, and if it snaps between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch, actually snaps rather than just kind of bends and doesn't snap. If it snaps within that width, then you have a good chance of pulling off a burn. Okay, understory species composition is pretty important. So even in wet areas, I've been able to burn during the winter if I've had the right understory species composition. The big ones that are kind of more well-known are bracken fern and bear clover. And there are others out there, but bracken fern and bear clover are both flammable in the wintertime, even when the soil moisture beneath them is relatively wet. Okay, the fuel bed, the actual composition of the fuel bed is important. You know, the density and piece size that we have, and what makes me think about, or the kind of burning context that this makes me think about is masticated fuel. And this picture is from a really good burn that we had as part of a firefighter surrogate study that we have at Blodgett Forest. And this is masticated fuel that really enabled this burn to occur. The other key things, this is on a northeast-facing slope, and so it was kind of a wet area. It was on January 2nd of 2019. The canopy cover was low density, so that helped, but it was really that masticated fuel bed. In this case, it had been curing for 1 year. And I think masticated fuel beds, we have really good opportunities to burn that fuel and to inhibit a ladder fuel development by burning that fuel in the wintertime. Quick side story here, a firefighter tried to put this out. This was a beautiful burn. It was during the time of year when I didn't need a permit. A firefighter saw the smoke and came and called it a wildfire. And luckily I saw them in time, and I had to explain the fact that I did not need a burn permit. And he really had a hard time understanding it, to be honest, at first, but eventually he did kind of understand that this was a perfectly fine and legal and legitimate thing to be doing. Okay, weather, of course, is king when you get into this. Those of you who have any kind of understanding of prescribed fire know this. Weather is king, and so it's just some really kind of rules of thumb that I've developed over the years. What I do is I start to, when I see a dry spell coming on in the winter, I start to track the days since the last precipitation, and so even in a wet forest, like where I've been working at 4,000 feet elevation in the mid Sierra Nevada, it takes about 10 days. So after about 10 days since the last heavy precipitation, that's when I can start to think about burning. Of course, I measure 10-hour fuel moisture. Once it gets down below 8%, then I start to do the snap test, and then I start to track weather. And this is, you need to develop your own prescription for your own location, but this is just an example of what I tend to use: 25 to 40% humidity, wind less than 9 miles an hour, and temperature less than 70 degrees. Okay, so I want to do this. I know I'm running a little long here, so I want to go through this really quickly, but this is just some data that I have. Some of you are probably thinking that, this guy's just full of crap, and it's not. We don't actually have these opportunities to burn. But these are some weather data that I pulled up in a wet forest, where I thought about the actual, what do the weather data suggest in terms of the number of days that you might be able to burn? And so when I apply those factors of burning in winter burning, I went through this weather data from 2012 and 2013. And I tried to figure out, okay, how many days did we have during that year that were good, reasonable days for pulling off a prescribed burn? And so what I did is I looked for all the days during that winter period where that day had been at least 10 days since the last precipitation. I then identified, of those days, how many of them had minimum relative humidity less than 45%, because that's kind of the prescription I need. And then of those days, how many were allowable in terms of air quality. And so going through here, I went through this data from the full winter period, 2012, 2013, and there were 48 days during that winter where, an individual day had been more than 10 days since the last precip event. Of those days, 37 had minimum of relative humidities less than 45%. Now, I did not have the exact air quality data. I didn't know how many of those 37 days were no burn days, but taking a very conservative approach, or I guess maybe a liberal approach, depending on how you view it, but basically if I assume that 30% of those days were no burn days, and it was likely much lower than that. But assuming 30% of those days were no burn days, then I still had 26 days during that winter period where the weather data suggests that there was a pretty good opportunity to pull off a prescribed burn. And that's from 2012, 2013. As you may recall, this most recently in this winter period in February, it was a beautiful burn window. We had a really long dry spell, and I burned for 2 weeks straight, and I got over 100 acres done, where it wasn't just the litter layer that was burning. We had really good consumption down to the, into the larger fuel size classes as well. Okay, just an example here of a burn success, and I'm getting towards the end here, bear with me. This is from Blodgett Forest Research Station, a 60-acre compartment that has been burned several times in the past 6 years. So this is an area that has really good timber value. We've been thinning it, and getting good yield. So we've yielded 1,000 board feet per acre per year, and through all winter burning, this is all winter burning without a permit, we've been able to lower the fire hazard so that the torching probability is 0.1 and the torching index is 80 miles an hour. So that's really good. Like, it's as good as you can get, I think, in terms of a forest structure in the mixed conifer forest, in terms of lowering fire hazard. And it's all been done through commercial harvesting, through that thinning, and then also through winter burning. The key factors were being nimble. This is a picture of our burn crew. The last time we burned this, it was just 3 people. That was all. It was just 3 people. That's all we needed because the risk was so low during this time of year. Okay, yesterday was good. Let's see, what's today? Today is April 16th. So April 15th, at my property at 3,000 feet elevation, I'm in an open burn status, so I didn't need a permit. I do have an air quality permit to do this, but I burned at 3,000 feet elevation. And it was a good burn day. I think today is pretty good as well. When I'm done with this talk, I think I'm going to go out and do a little bit of burning. To give an example of how common it is right now, it's not super common, but it is starting to occur more and more. This is what I've seen recently over the past few years, is people are catching on. Even some agencies are catching on to this idea. And so this is from the Air Resources Board, PFERs. So those of you who are familiar with doing PFERs, this is the number of burns, at least the burns that were big enough to require a smoke management plan. There were 15 across the whole state that were occurring yesterday. 4 of them were broadcast burns, the rest were pile burns. And so they were pretty small. There's a couple CAL FIRE broadcast burns here and here that were 2 acres. There were private land broadcast burns over in the coastal range that were bigger, 100 acres. But my point here is that yesterday was a good burn day at 3,000 feet elevation, and if winter burning catches on, ideally what we see is this map just littered, just kind of full of all these symbols across private and agency burns, on a day like yesterday and on a day like today. That's kind of the trend, that I think is possible when it comes to winter burning in California. Okay, and this is my second to last slide. I'm almost done here. Winter burning, new research and extension. This is part of a research and extension project that I've just gotten involved with. It's just got funded for the next 3 years. It's called Sparks Cal, Smart Practices in Architecture for Prescribed Burns in California. And winter burning is one of the main topics that we got funding to look at. And so these are some research topics. I want you to stay tuned because we're going to have some good, I hope, some good research products and some good extension products all around this topic of winter burning that are going to be coming out over the next couple of years. And these are just some of the research topics: quantifying fuel consumption in the winter versus other seasons, like actually documenting how effective winter burning can be. We want to look at understory composition and forest structures also that can facilitate winter burns. This is a burn. This picture is from a burn that's part of this project, specifically looking at a mature plantation, or at least mature in the sense that, it's older than a lot of plantations you see. Well, it's 30 years, so not as old, certainly as old as it will get in this case. But the idea here is to look at winter burning in this plantation type of structure And then also mapping climatic and topographic sweet spots for burning. And this is something really interesting that we could develop, that I hope to develop, is identifying across the state at various scales, where are opportunities, given the climate and given topographic microclimates, like where our opportunities actually might be for winter burning. Okay, that is all I have. I thank you sincerely. I thank you for making it this far in the talk. It went a little bit longer than I had anticipated, so sorry about that. If you do get out there and try to do some winter burning, I would really like to know how it goes. So let me know. Thank you for your attention with this.